So my name is Justin Bennett. I am the front-end architect, Scripts Networks Interactive. So I work on sites like HGTV and Food Network and DIY. We actually don't use Vue in our main production sites, but I like to dabble a lot in it, and it's got some really interesting principles. So today I'm going to talk about scalable component styles, or how not to pull your hair out when you're doing CSS. So there's this principle I want to kind of discuss before I really dive into the talk. It's the pit of success. There's a really good talk online by Mark Seaman. It's called Functional Architecture, the Pit of Success. So he talks about how good system design makes it, you make it easy to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong thing, right? You want it to, when you're building a system, you don't want to feel like you're pushing a ball up a hill and trying to balance it on the top of the hill. You want to feel like it's just kind of rolling down the hill and like the natural equilibrium is the correct place. So when I'm thinking about architecture or looking at APIs or whatever, I always kind of come back to that notion as like, does this put me in the pit of success, or am I on the hill of failure, I guess? How hard is this going to be maintained? How much cognitive energy do the developers who are using this need to put forth to kind of continue on the good path? So I'll kind of refer back to this a little bit, but I also thought this quote was kind of interesting, and it kind of just reiterates what I just said. And I have resources at the end of the slides. I'm just going to send out links. I'll put them on Meetup. I'll send them on Twitter. So don't worry about like capturing anything. So let's do a little thought experiment. Let's pretend for a second that the world of JavaScript was just like the world of CSS. All right. This is actually probably true, in the early 2000s. So everything is global. All things are global. We don't do scoping. We don't need that. So we can get around collisions, global collisions, by naming conventions. We'll just do really good naming conventions and hope they're consistent, and hope we don't accidentally overwrite things or whatever. It's all right. And it's awesome that we're using globals, because now we can include these other scripts and just use all their globals, and then we can have these like really interesting interactions with globals across everything. And then you need some implementation details of something configurable. Just add some more globals to it. Why not? Just decorate them on. You got dead code. Is it really dead code? Are you sure it's dead code? Yeah, it might be useful. It might be necessary somewhere. I mean, everything's global. It's you probably can't just pull that out without some unknown repercussions at some place somewhere. And there are times where you just got to duplicate code just because, cover your bases. I don't know about you, but God, that'd be scary. Just globals everywhere. But that's more or less what we have with CSS. And there's a lot of other problems. So the global namespace is one that I kind of harp on a lot. But there are a lot of implicit dependencies, right? So, I mean, whether we acknowledge it or not, the markup that you write is, directly dependent on the selectors for, styles. So, I mean, these things have these kind of implicit dependencies. And, it can be hard sometimes to see, where are these styles going to, or where are they coming from, or why is this thing doing this? And, you can have this cascade of failures, if you will. So anyway, it can be difficult to develop really robust, and getting to the next point, isolated code. So if you're styling a component, making sure that your styles are only applying to that component and not, globally somewhere else. So, dead code or duplication or just general bloat, it's a very hard thing to deal with in, straight CSS. And then the principle of non-determinate resolution. So, I mean, in CSS, if two selectors have the same specificity, so they have the same value, if you will, they're of the same importance, whichever one comes last is the one that's going to take precedent, right? As we get more into more in these like dynamic builds, and we got module dependencies all over the place, you might not know when that's going to happen. It depends on what entry module you're using or whatever. So it can be pretty hairy. And there was a talk, CSS-in-JS by Christopher Chedeau. I probably butchered his name, but he's a Facebook engineer, and this was back in like 2015, and he kind of started this notion of, like CSS is kind of broken. We need like newer abstractions to kind of help solve some of these problems. It's a great talk. Also, I have it linked. I'd recommend you checking it out. That talk inspired a lot of spin-off tools and a lot of interesting things. So I don't know if any of you have heard of CSS-Modules, but that was another tool set that came off of that original thought process. Is like, hey, we got to deal with these hard problems. Like what we have now is not getting us where we need to be. So Vue has some different tools that you might see people using. At the base level, you might see somebody developing components with just normal naming conventions. So think BEM, if you've heard of that. If you're not, I'll explain it later. There are scope styles, which is a very Vue-specific thing, which I'll talk about later, and even CSS modules. You might rarely even see CSS-in-JS used with Vue. It's more used with the React community because React is more about, let's do everything in JavaScript. And I'm not actually going to get into that. That is a whole another deep dive, but I'll have some interesting resources later. So just to dive right in, we talk about like naming conventions. So this is, the first approach you might take to trying to solve some of those earlier problems, especially global namespaces, right? So BEM is kind of a common naming convention. So you have your block, which will reference directly to whatever your component would be. You have an element, which would be, some element inside that component. And then a modifier, which could be a state or a flag or something. So here's a quick example. So this is a single file component. If you haven't seen these, just imagine that it compiles out to what you see. So things to note is between, like, if you look at the template section, the divs the div and the h1 and everything are all prefixed with the greeting, which is the name of the component, right? So we're scoping these styles using a naming convention. So nothing wrong with this. This will absolutely work. The great thing is you don't need any special build tools with this. You don't need to use a single file component. You can just include some markup and include Vue just via script tag, and this approach will work. An interesting thing about this approach, though, is like let's talk about the base button really quick. So the base button is just like an extra component, right? How would you normally target a child component, and should you target a child component? So in this example, we could do the greeting, and then with a descendant selector, we could do base button. And that would probably work, assuming your base button actually had the class of base button as the first element. So that would be a potential way of targeting that. But in this example, it's very easy to see kind of like, yeah, probably work. But if you can imagine like a more complicated component, it's hard for you to make assumptions about what's going on in the internals of that child component. Because, that's an implementation detail, right? Like the selectors that are in there. So we have these implicit dependencies on what the expectations are of, the class structure. So, for example, if you had like a component with like nested components and you only wanted to target the top level, you'd have to get into like child selectors and things, and it can get kind of hairy. So yeah, maybe not the best approach. But maybe, we could say just put a class on it and use a normal BEM convention. And this is kind of my first naive approach. And I was like, yeah, that feels right? And then I can just target the greeting base button class and then, put the styles on it I want. The only thing is that's kind of very naive because now it's a prop and that doesn't work. As a matter of fact, class prop is just invalid altogether. You can't use class as a prop. So note. So tried out something a little different. So instead of passing class, tried passing class name. Same sort of thing, except that'll get passed down to the child component. So if you look on the bottom, that is the base button. So the first class that you see is the normal class that it'll output with. And the second one, which is a dynamic binding, that's Vue shortcut for binding, is getting the class name prop, and those will just be concatenated with a space. But again, going back to that notion of the pit of success, it seems like there's a lot of things that could go wrong here. Like, so if I take this approach, for every new component, I need to bind that prop, and I just have to have the cognitive overhead of doing that over and over. Or if I take the previous approach of using descendant selectors, then I have the chance of my styles cascading and affecting a child component in a way that I want. So BEM is obviously, it's a useful solution, but there are problems. And one of the things I'll note is, I'm not really going to talk about it a whole lot, but you can use preprocessors, and pretty much that apply in all the examples. You can use it regardless of your approach. So in this case, I'm just importing a brand presets file and using that to populate a headline color. So there's just an aside that preprocessors are there. So the next big approach, and probably the most popular and probably the best to use, is scope styles. So the scope styles in Vue is kind of interesting. If you'll notice, there is a scope tag on the style block. So when you add that scope tag, it will essentially, so it'll essentially put this markup. So on every element of that block, it'll put an attribute. So when it's targeting styles, it will use a attribute selector and apply whatever kind of overwrite your styles. So if you're looking in the top code block where you see headline color red, normally it would just headline red, right? But being that it's scoped, it'll be scoped to, or it uses the attribute selector to scope the styles. So this is a good way of kind of avoiding that global namespace, right? It doesn't add a whole lot of cognitive overhead. You don't have to say, okay, what special naming convention do I need to use? What class do I need to use? It's just, applying the class that you feel is necessary for that situation. If you have a functional component or a stateful component, and whether it is scoped or whether it is not scoped, can have implications on what is output to the DOM in this scenario. So if we're looking at the markup result down here, if this was a functional, if the child component was functional but not scoped, then the parent's attributes would flow all the way down that component. But if it was scoped, it would get its own attributes. If the component was stateful and not functional, then even not scoped, it would only get the parent's attribute on the top. So it's a whole thing. It's an easy way to get yourself tripped up. Yeah. All right. So kind of last approach that I'm going to talk about is CSS modules. So I was saying CSS modules came out of that kind of, was motivated by the CSS-in-JS talk. So they're trying to take a different approach of how to solve both the naming, global namespace, and how to deal with composition. So in this particular case, you'll notice that where we said scope before, now we're saying module. So this is built into kind of Vue's single file component setup. Vue Loader will automatically transform this into kind of what you'd like to see. So it will go through each of the classes in your style block and basically build a map where the class name is the key and the value is a space separated list of class names to kind of translate to. So in this particular case, we have headline with a color of red. That will be read in by Vue Loader there's an object that's created and put in the current component instance. By default, it's this $style object. And if you'll notice, for the H2 here, I'm doing $style dot headline, and I've got that class the class attribute is bound. So it's actually reading that style dot headline and then taking whatever the actual classes would be and then injecting them. So this is also available to JavaScript, right? So if you needed to do something with your class names or whatever, you'd have availability of that. The interesting thing is, though, the name of the component and the output markup, or the name of the class, is actually dynamically generated. So in this case, it's just kind of what the tool I was using put out, but just via a Webpack configuration, you can change this to whatever you want. So if you wanted to minify your selectors, it makes it really easy to do so. And here's an example of doing composition with CSS modules. So CSS modules actually adds this composes syntax. So you see composes headline color from this other file. So essentially what it'll do is it'll read that file and treat it like a module. So again, that file will have its own custom generated class names. And when headline gets output here, it will be the class name that it has, that it needs, and the compose class for the styles that you got from the other style sheet. So it kind of handles composition by chaining class names together. There are some caveats with this, like with everything. So if you're composing two style blocks and they're both setting something, so like let's say you compose, in this case, headline color and like description color for whatever reason to this headline, then they will be it's kind of that same non-determinate, because depending on how they get loaded, it might, you can't really tell the order. So composes has to have unique attributes. Anyway, so that's an interesting problem with CSS modules. So that's kind of the basics of what I have. I have a lot of resources here, and I'll add some more later, especially for the scoped block gotchas. So as of now, I would definitely recommend using the scope block. It definitely has some gotchas, but it's just kind of the easiest thing to do. So an interesting challenge to the community is, I think, going back to that cognitive overhead of having to push a ball up a hill versus the pit of success. I think having to think about, I got to write this scoped attribute for every one of these style blocks is probably not the best case. So maybe somebody can write a loader that will automatically make your style block scope by default, and then you do global to make them global and shared, because make it easy to do the right thing. So that's all I got. Anybody got any questions?
Last I checked, and this was like maybe a month ago, but scopes won't work for components that use keyframes. Has there been a solution or a solution for that?
I don't know. I don't know that there has yet. Style blocks have this interesting, or scope style blocks has an interesting ability to target descendant selectors. So if you do, it's like 3 arrows to the side, or 3 greater thans, it will like target the base component, so it'll rejiggle the attribute so you can actually target the child component. That's probably a feature that not a lot of people know about, but anyway. Yeah, so that's all I got.